Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Tracy, and if you don't know me, I have a passion for upcycling clothing and I teach sewing on here. I'm so excited to finally bring you guys the tutorial on this Silk Halter mini dress. I ended up upcycling a silk dress I thrifted. This was the dress before and this is the dress after. But just remember, if you get something that is silk, you have to just patchwork everything correctly so it all lays on the bias before you actually cut the fabric out. So feel free to upcycle something, or you can just buy your own fabric. As always, I made a digital sewing pattern for you guys and that's available on my Etsy shop. I have linked it down below. This pattern is a bit more intermediate, advanced level, so I do recommend having some sewing knowledge before you jump into making a bias dress. To make the silk halter dress, you're going to need about 2 yards of like any silk fabric. As you can see, this fabric is a Silk Charmeuse and it's like a burnout. You can see some of these parts are sheer and it's quite beautiful. You get a really stunning effect. And for lining, you're also going to need 2 yards. If you do get a burnout silk, just make sure you get a lining that matches, because then you end up with like such a beautiful color matched effect. And on my dress, I ended up adding this ruffled trim to the lining's hem and it gave it such a beautiful effect. As you can see, I also added it around the armhole, but that was because I had a little bit too much side cleavage showing. So don't worry, on the sewing pattern you get the full coverage. This was just the prototype, so I made that adjustment. The ruffle trim is optional. There's also some beautiful lace ruffles that you can add to the bottom, which I think are super cute, or you can just like add lace trim to the hem, like any kind of detail you want. And for the side closure, I used 15 pearl like shank buttons, but feel free to use an invisible zipper and you can just like add that to the side seam instead. And you need 1 yard of that elastic loop trim. I have linked all the required materials down in the description box for you guys, so I hope you guys enjoy this tutorial. This is the silk dress I thrifted, so I always start by just cutting out the shoulders and removing the sleeves. Then I cut out the side seam so I can get like the most out of the fabric. And if you thrifted something, the easiest way to find the straight grain on any kind of garment is to just like snip a bit and just tear, and then you get the straight grain. I do this to 2 sides so I can just match up the corner to the corner of my cutting board. And if you're going to cut out silk fabric, I always recommend to lay down paper first, then your fabric, and then your pattern on top. I just did not have any extra pattern paper with me this time. You guys can watch my silk prom dress. I have linked it above, and here I show you guys how to lay out the paper, the fabric, and then your pattern on top, just so you make sure that it's actually cut on the true bias. As you can see, when I was cutting out my pattern pieces, I didn't have enough fabric, so I ended up having to patchwork the parts that I cut away and just attach it to the bottom of the front of the dress and the back of the dress. So I had to just tear the straight grain, and on the other pieces find the straight grain also, and then place right sides together and overlock those. That's how I was able to have enough fabric to cut out the entire piece. And I repeated those exact steps to the back skirt, so I would have enough fabric to cut out the entire piece. And thankfully for the lining, I had bought 2 yards of silk fabric, so I was able to just cut out those pieces entirely and didn't need to patchwork anything. After cutting out all of my pattern pieces, I just start by taking the front of the dress, the main fabric, and the lining, and just pinning those darts into place. So just match up your notches and pin all the way up to the apex point. I always suggest marking your dart just because it's so much easier when you take it to the sewing machine to just follow that line you made with your fabric marker than just going in blind. So I go ahead and mark it, so just follow the exact shape, because this is a curved dart on the sewing pattern, so you just need to be careful and actually mark that so you're sewing the curve and not just a straight line to that apex point. Now you can take it to your regular sewing machine and sew those darts into place. So sew the main fabric and the lining. Back tack when you first start sewing, but when you get to the apex point, just let the thread hang off, and you can see that you end up with like tails of thread, and you want to just make about like 3 knots to tie that dart off. Take it to your iron and just give it a good press, so you always want to press that dart up. And repeat it to your lining. And before we start sewing everything together, you need to attach some fusible interfacing to the wearer's left side. This is where we're going to place the buttons. I like to use this 1-inch fusible stay tape, and to make this stay tape go in like a curve, iron a bit at a time. So as you place the iron, you can just like curve the stay tape a bit, and you can see that notch will like open it to your desired shape, and then just do that along the side. And I only ended up cutting about like a 7-8 inch long piece of stay tape, because we don't need it all the way down the side seam, just the place where the buttons are going to be. And you only need to do this on your wearer's left side of your main fabric. The lining doesn't need any stay tape. so it's just on the wearer's left side. Before we can start sewing anything again, you need to just do a stay stitch at your side seams and your neckline of all of your pieces, your main fabric and your lining, and then you can overlock that. So you just take it to your regular sewing machine, stitch with a stitch size 5. So this will help prevent the fabric from growing, and then you can just overlock that so it's clean finished before we sew any seams together. Take your front and your back of the dress and place right sides together and pin along the side seam, but on the side seam with the stay tape, you just need to pin from the bottom of the stay tape all the way to the hem, and you're just going to take this to your sewing machine and sew with the 1/2 inch seam allowance. And for the lining, just take your front and the back of the dress and place right sides together and only pin along the wearer's right side, because we need the wearer's left side open so we can turn the whole dress inside out when we attach the lining to the main fabric. Don't make the mistake of sewing both side seams on the lining, because I ended up doing that and I had to seam rip it later, so just learn from my mistake. Take it to your sewing machine and sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and don't forget to back tack. Whenever you're working with silk, it's very important after sewing a seam to just take it to your iron and give it a good press. Take your loop trim, and I measured about, I think, like 9 inches, and I only ended up using 15 loops, but you need a little bit extra just to like sew it into the seam so it's a nice finish and it's just not cut at the end randomly. Take your loop trim and just place it on the wearer's left side on the main fabric. So you're going to place this on the front of the dress and make sure that the loops are facing towards the other side seam. The neckline finish is going to be a 1/2 inch, so I like to mark where the first loop is going to be and then place a pin and take it to the sewing machine, and then I just stitch it into place. I like to shift the trim a little bit towards the inside and then measure from the outside of that seam allowance 3/8 and stitch the trim into place so it doesn't move. Now you can take your lining and place right sides together and just pin along that neckline. So you're just going to pin around the back, just the back neckline. So you're going to leave the top of the collar alone and just pin the lining towards the armhole and just the back necklines. And if you want to add the little spaghetti strap detail I have at the back, this is where you need to insert it. So you're going to insert it at the corners of those side seams and just encase it in between the main fabric and the lining. And when you attach the lining, you also want to pin along the wearer's left side down that trim that we attached, and the other side as well. Take it to your sewing machine and just sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So remember, you're stitching those armholes, the back neckline, and the wearer's left side along those button loops and the other side as well. Whenever you sew a corner, it's super important to mark that seam allowance so you know where you need to pivot. So when you reach that 1/2 inch seam allowance mark, you can just pivot and sew straight down. After you attach the lining, don't forget that it's important to trim those corners so there's not so much fabric. When you turn it right side out, it'll just like bulk a bit in that corner. So now you're able to turn it a lot easier. And I like to use like a crochet hook or anything with like a dull end to just kind of get that corner pushed all the way out. And now you can just give the lining a good press. So you want to just like roll the lining underneath and then just give it a good press. You can do an understitch, but I found it kind of hard with this kind of neckline. So you should just be fine with just giving it a good press. And we just need to go back in on the lining on the wearer's left side. You can see how that seam is just left open in order for us to turn it right side out. So now you can actually take those front and back at that side seam and just pin it in place. And now just take it to your sewing machine and just sew a 1/2 inch and try to get as close as you can to the bottom of the loop closure. Don't forget to back tack so you can lock the stitches. Grab your collar pieces, the main fabric and the lining. Take your main fabric collar piece and make sure the wrong side is facing you, and take your fusible stay tape and just place it on top of both sides of that collar. This is going to help the button closure be a lot sturdier. And if needed, don't forget to notch the stay tape so you're able to shape it to the collar shape. Iron it on and don't forget to trim the excess. Take some loop trim, and the same way we applied it to the side seam on the side of the dress, we're going to apply it to the center back closure of the collar. So you're going to place these loops and take into account the 1/2 inch seam allowance at the top and the bottom. So you're just going to stitch that into place and leave some excess so we can do like a nice finish. Make sure the loops are facing away from the center back when you're stitching it into place. Take your lining and just place right sides together, encasing those loops and sewing the top of the neckline and down the other center back seam. So you're going up, across, and down. Take it to the sewing machine and just sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and don't forget to pivot at the corners. Trim at the corners so you remove some of that bulk before you turn it right side out. And because we have 2 corners, I'm also using that dull crochet hook to just kind of poke those corners out, and you can see how nice our button loops look finished. Roll the lining underneath and just give it a good press. Before attaching the collar to the neckline, overlock both layers together at the neckline, the main fabric, and the lining, and then just find your center front, mark that, and now you can just take your collar and just grab your main fabric on the collar. Take your collar and only line up the main fabric to the neckline of the dress. So we're going to be encasing everything with the lining later. So we're just pinning along the neckline until we reach both ends of the main fabric on the collar with the dress neckline. And now you can just take it to your sewing machine and just sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Trim the excess threads, and you can see how the lining is just hanging there right now on the back of the collar, but you're going to just take the lining and fold it up a little bit more than a 1/2 inch seam allowance, just so it doesn't peek through on the front, and then just grab a pin and pin it into place. So do that along the neckline until you reach the corner. You're going to just fold everything inside, pin so everything's perfectly squared off. After pinning the lining into place, I like to just baste this down just so I know the lining is secure and I don't have pins in the way in my sewing machine. And now you can take it to your sewing machine and just do an 1/8 of an inch top stitch along that neckline all the way from one end of the collar through the neckline through the other end of the collar. And now we can attach the buttons. This is probably the most time consuming part because you have to sew each individual button by hand. So what I like to do is to just take both corners of the wearer's left side seam and just line it up and place a pin where that button loop is going to hug onto that button. And you can see I'm kind of just pinning on that side and through the loop and up to just hold that side seam into place. Making that closure kiss with the pins, you can just take your fabric marker and just mark the top of that button loop, and that is where you're going to be placing your button. So I like to just mark them all first, and then I remove the pins, and now I just go in with my button and just sew it by hand. And if you don't know how to sew shank buttons by hand, I have linked a tutorial for you guys down below. And you're just going to repeat these exact steps to the center back of the collar and just attach those buttons there too. For hemming your dress, it's very important to let your dress hang for 24 hours to let the silk grow before you decide on your final hemline. It's always going to be uneven when you sew with silk, so it's super important to try the dress on and just mark your new hemline. Once you've cut your final hem, now you can just remove 2.5 inches from your lining to attach your pleated trim or lace trim or whatever you want to do. Just make sure you remove the exact width from the lining. Pin right sides together of the trim and the lining, and when you measure out the full length after you pin, you can just close that trim off so it fits the exact measurement of the hem. And I just take it to the overlock machine and just overlock the trim to the lining hem. You can also just overlock the lining first and the trim, and then just sew it with a regular sewing machine if you prefer. You end up sewing it with just a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now the lining's hem is finished and we can move on to the main fabric hem. So you're going to take your main fabric, and because this design has that pleated trim peeking through, you're going to just remove 2 inches from the main fabric hem. So you're able to see the pleated trim peeking through and not the seam. So that's why you want to give like that 1/2 inch leeway. So I'm only removing 2 inches. It looks so good just having that pleated trim peek through the bottom. I like to do a rolled hem finish on my main fabric with my overlock machine. So I start by removing the left needle and changing the tension on the upper looper to an 8.5 and on the lower looper to an 8. Then I changed my stitch width to a 0.6, so it's like the smallest width. Just change my feed to do a rolled hem. So on my machine, it lets me switch it to a rolled hem finish, and I put it to about like a 1.5. Then I shift my blade away so it's not cutting too much fabric. Now you can take your main fabric and just place it at the edge of your presser foot and just feed it through your sewing machine, and you can see that it'll start grabbing the fabric and rolling it slightly while it stitches the thread on top, and it gives you such a beautiful rolled hem finish. I love doing rolled hem finishes on silk, but feel free if you want on your regular sewing machine to just do a baby hem and you get a really crisp, clean finish as well. After sewing your hem, just give it a good press. This is the part where I tried the dress on and realized I had a little bit too much side cleavage sewing, so I needed to just cover it somehow, and I had some leftover pleated trims. I pinned it into place and just basted it so it was easier to take to the sewing machine. I ended up making that little back spaghetti strap adjustable, and if you need a tutorial, I have linked one down below for you guys. And now the dress is completely done, and here's how it looks on. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial, and if you do recreate this dress, please don't forget to tag me on Instagram. I would love to see your final dresses. And as a big thank you for the first 24 hours, I have given you guys a discount code on the sewing pattern. I have linked it down below for you guys. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. It really is the best way to support your favorite creators for free. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you next time.